And thank everyone for joining the Art and Science of Resilience, today's presentation on thriving and overcoming uncertainty. I'm Eric Frazer, and my co-host is Chris Holliday, and she's going to kick off her intro.
Hi. Thanks, Eric, and thanks everybody for joining. My name's Chris Holliday. I'm an executive coach and corporate trainer, and my specialty is helping senior leaders be the best they can possibly be. And I do that by combining traditional leadership development processes and techniques, and combining that with my experience as a performing artist. I've learned a lot in the last 12 years about business through being an actor. And so I like to bring both of those disciplines into my work, and it's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. So that's me, Eric.
Excellent, yeah. And I'm a clinical psychologist, and today we have the advantage of really bringing in the beautiful balance of the arts and sciences. And my background and perspective on resilience comes from a scientific framework, and really on a framework of a topic that I'm really passionate about, which is how do we maximize and optimize human potential? And there's many ways that we get into that. And today, of course, we're focusing on resilience and really how we develop and craft resilience in some very practical ways, built on both science and art. And we do that in this pandemic time that we're at and dealing with this uncertainty. So we're going to dive right in and talk about the art and science of these various facets in today's presentation. Uncertainty comes from this notion of not knowing what's happening. And in my conversations, really across the span, we're all dealing with this experience of uncertainty, which is not knowing what the morning's going to be like. You know, we've got families, we've got loved ones, friends, workplace commitments, and we're all dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And it's kind of like, even yesterday in a conversation, it's like the pink elephant in the room. You know, the de facto response is that everything's okay, but everything really isn't okay. And part of this uncertainty is acknowledging that it's actually happening, right? And the other piece of the scientific framework behind this is acknowledging that the effect of uncertainty on us as people is that it creates anxiety, and an anxiety state affects our nervous system. So our nervous system is really broken down into these experiences during the day of feeling tense, of ruminating over ideas, not feeling productive, not being able to attend. And we call that, just as the slide, you know, sort of articulates, system dysregulation, right? So we're not regulated, we're not in balance or in harmony. So that's what uncertainty does from us. The cognitive component of this is the irrational thinking, right? We get into these loops like, what if this doesn't happen? What if I don't get my goals met today? What if I can't manage my children and monitor them and be a home teacher today and get things done that I'm responsible for at work? So when we get into that state of uncertainty, that anxious state, we become dysregulated, we ruminate over these uncertainties, these what ifs, right? And that kind of paralyzes us. And that is the experience, that is the sort of psychological and the emotional and the behavioral experience of uncertainty. And we're going to give you some practical tips about how to overcome that today, that you can put into practice, that are proven methods from the arts and from the sciences to give you better tools in your toolkit on a daily basis.
That's amazing, Eric. I love all of what you said. And it makes a lot of sense, especially as I apply it to my experience as an actor. There are few worlds as uncertain as an actor's life. You know, you go out for an audition, you never know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen in the audition room. You don't know what's going to happen on set. You don't know whether they're even going to tell you whether or not you get the job. So living as an actor, you live with a lot of uncertainty. And the way that we deal with it, or the way that people deal with it healthily in that arena is to look at it as a gift. I remember there was one one time I was shooting a pilot, and my job was to, in the scene, I didn't have any lines, but the job was to throw a handkerchief up in the air on a given cue. And I did so. I got the cue. I threw the handkerchief up in the air, and you don't know where it's going to land. You don't know what's going to happen. It was a comedy, thank goodness, because it landed on my head. And that was such a gift that we, you could never plan things like that. And if you let go of the idea of, I have to control this, you allow for better things to happen than you planned. And so as actors, what we do to allow those things to happen is to develop a well-tuned instrument. We are our instrument. A flute player has a flute. You keep it tuned. A pianist keeps his piano tuned. We as actors have to keep our bodies, minds, etc. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more later. But having a well-tuned instrument is the best way to be prepared for what happens in uncertainty. And we more in science. I also have a master's in education, and there's this thing called a state of relaxed preparedness. And that's where you want to be. You want to be prepared, so have done all the work, but you want to be in a relaxed enough state that you allow things to happen. And that's how being an actor, and among other things, has helped me prepare for uncertainty. And also the viewpoint, and we'll talk again about perspectives, but being able to see uncertainty as a potential gift is just one of the ways that we learn to cope with uncertainty.
Great. So this brings us right into a topic. Whoops. There we go. Vulnerability and uncertainty really go hand in hand. And we're going to talk about, in essence, how do you put this into practice? And the practice with this comes in this term that everybody is probably familiar with now from all the social media, which is mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is being able to focus on the present moment. Simple as that. There are many variations and themes and practices associated with mindfulness, but mindfulness opens you up to the vulnerability that you're experiencing, right? And letting go of the control. It gives you permission to be able to distance yourself, right? To create some space between the uncertainty of the experience, the stress, the tension that you're having, and then being able to recalibrate, to rebalance. It's really important to be able to do that. So there's a number of tools that you can use. There's a lot of meditation tools, apps, and such. One of my favorite tools is one called Insight Timer. It's free. And it gives you the opportunity to simply put into practice for 1 minute, for 2 minutes, for 5 minutes, or however long you like it. It could be once a day, twice a day. I hear people doubling up on, tripling up on these kinds of things lately. But it's giving yourself that opportunity to create that space, to create that present moment. And the practice isn't necessarily just sitting down in silence, which it could be. You could have background music, you could have chimes, you could have Amazon music in the background. Those are all different examples when you're engaging in an app-like practice. Another kind of simple practice is walking meditation or walking mindfulness, which was articulated and written about by a book by Thich Nhat Hanh. It's something that you can check out. But the notion is that no matter what you're doing, whether it's washing dishes or simply walking slowly, it's noticing the experience in the moment, right? And noticing the experience can be as simple as paying attention to what it feels like on the bottom of your feet when you're walking, or what it feels like when you're cleaning a pan in the sink and doing something very normal and typical and routine and mundane, like doing dishes. The point of all of that goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is it disengages you from those ruminative thoughts, and it disengages you from paying attention to feeling nervous, because you can't pay attention to two things at the same time. So if you're acknowledging and being present and focusing on the sensations in your feet when you're walking, or your breathing when you're listening to a meditation, or the scrubbing when you're washing a pan, that is what calms down the dysregulation component to all of this.
Yeah, it's so important to be present in the present moment, especially, you know, in uncertain times. When I first became an actor, I had a mindset, because I came from corporate, and my mindset was that I had to be in control of my emotions. I had to be to look like I had it put together, that being vulnerable was never something that I was allowed to or wanted to show anybody. And when I started acting, the rules were flip-flopped, and it freaked me out, because they said, you're too in your head. And I'm like, but that's a good thing. And they're like, no, you can't be in your head. You need to be more vulnerable. I remember an early acting coach that I had, who literally said mean things to me to make me cry. And it was a really painful experience, but I learned soon by watching fellow classmates, acting classmates, that it's way more interesting to watch somebody who is vulnerable, who expresses their vulnerability. And so it became a new norm, if in a way, and it allows you to be more creative. When I went back to corporate about 6 years ago, I discovered that actually there is room for vulnerability in a corporate setting, that it's not about like walking into a situation. I mean, like say you're a senior executive and you're about to, deal some bad news about furloughs or what have you in the COVID environment. It's not to say that you want to go in, with a wet hanky and sobbing because you're feeling sad about having to lay off, people that you care about. It's more about, and this a coach friend of mine named Louis Lubin out in San Francisco taught me this concept of selective vulnerability. And if you're a leader in an organization, you want to express some vulnerability, but not so much that it makes people uncomfortable. And so there's a space for it in the corporate world, but in your life, you absolutely want to allow yourself to be vulnerable, because if you don't, the emotions that come with the vulnerability are going to come out sideways, and they can hurt you, and they can hurt other people. So one, I think allow the vulnerability. It creates a lot of potential for creativity. It allows you to be open and not locked down to, the way you think you should be. It allows you to take appropriate emotional risks and build connection, right? So when you're vulnerable with others, it builds connection with them. If I see a leader get up at the front of the room and go, you know what? This is scary. This is scary stuff. And I'm scared too, but this is the course of action that we've decided to take. And I think it's the best course of action under the circumstances that any company could possibly take. I trust that individual. I trust him when he says that or when she says that. And so I strongly encourage my clients to take on a certain amount of selective vulnerability, and in their personal lives, find somebody who can be completely vulnerable, right? Somebody who you can pour your heart out to, because if you don't, it's going to, like I said, it's going to leak out the side. I have a friend, an actor friend, who from time to time we contact each other requesting permission slips. So she says, I need a permission slip to tell my parents I'm not going on vacation with them. It's whatever device you can use to give yourself the permission to feel vulnerable and permission to do the things that make you frightened. I can't recommend those enough. It's going to build the trust and the creativity that you want to have in your life.
Yeah, trust is really key. And again, just some notes for mindfulness on you that you can reflect on about staying connected and building all of this together. The next topic that we're going to talk about is perspective taking. And this has come up in a number of conversation, and it really it builds on everything that Chris and I have just spoken about in terms of the mindfulness and in terms of the vulnerability. And really the brass tacks are, how do you have conversations with coworkers and clients, right? And how do you reflect, number one, a sense of resilience, but also convey and communicate your experience of vulnerability, and doing so in a way that builds trust and validates the other person's feelings. And what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of resistance to doing that, to having the conversations and sort of skirting around the topic that things are not okay, that things are less than uncertain. And it really comes in to conversations where you start using the word we instead of how are you doing. You can start off with a declarative statement like, we're all going through a hard time, or I've heard from everyone in our organization, or we're hearing a lot of feedback about some of the challenges that we're facing today. So it creates a collective experience where there's a communal and collective vocabulary around this, and it shows that you have perspective taking of the other person's needs. So in those one-on-one conversations with coworkers, with clients, and you're validating them and you're showing your vulnerability, like, look, we're all going through some challenging times. Here's some things that we've been experiencing, or here's some things that we've been struggling with. Here's some challenges that we're hearing from other clients, from other coworkers. It opens the door for the other person to acknowledge, yes, we're going through that too, right? A real simple acknowledgement. And that perspective taking allows the conversation to become more personalized. People are not in a position right now to be thinking about sales and sales quotas and completing objectives in the way that they used to be, right? There has to be a trust building, a perspective building component to these conversations, a human personalized component to these conversations. And that's really the reframe that needs to happen. That shows that what's happening in that person's life matters to you, right? And we're going to talk about some of the communication techniques around that. But it's this notion of being able to relate and understand and reflect back what is mattering to the other person, to their life, to their struggles, to their capability of managing the uncertainty, and then being able to offer solutions and support built around that is really the first step of these conversations for restoring, rebuilding trust, and building resilience.
Yeah, I love the we, Eric. I think it's really important that, when we take a perspective, we realize that there are other people with perspectives as well. It was another interesting thing when I became an actor was in auditions, we're taught to, and even in acting in a scene, we're taught to make a choice. And that phrase confounded me for many years. But here's what it is. So I'm given a set of sides or piece of a script, and it's all it is a bunch of words, and the words mean something, yes, but it's a bunch of words. And so I might see a phrase that I'm supposed to say that says, "You look great today." I have to make a choice about what the circumstances are based on the rest of the script, how I'm feeling in my head, about how to say that phrase, and also make it interesting so that a casting director goes, "Oh, I like what she did with that." So if I see that phrase that says, "You look great today," I could say, "You look great today." Or I could say, "You look great today." Or I could say, "You look great today." Or I could say, "You look great today." So, it's a choice, and it's a perspective on the phrase that makes all the difference in what's understood when I've communicated it. And when we look at taking a perspective on what we broadcast, that's one thing, but there's also the perspective on how we take things in. So if I'm in a bad mood and I hear you look great today, it might lift me up a little bit, or it might make me go, go away. I don't want to hear that right now. You have to be aware of your own perception, your own frame on things. And in my coach training, I learned an amazing technique for doing just that. I don't think we're going to have time to cover it today, but I will offer, if you want to email me, I can walk you through a 10-15 minute process. But basically it's identifying the problem that you're looking at or the situation and saying, this is how it makes me feel. These are the characteristics of this problem, blah, 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 blah. And then not distracting yourself, but actually physically removing yourself and looking out your window, for example, and seeing a cloud and saying, what are the attributes of that? And if I were to apply those characteristics to this problem or situation, how does it shift? What new insights do I have about that problem or situation? And it's, I've never failed to shift once, failed to shift a client's perspective on their situation and come up with new ideas for possible problem solving. It's a super valuable technique. And again, we don't have time to cover it today, but I'm happy to teach it to anybody who reaches out.
That's great, Chris. And you just reminded me of a story that I feel compelled to tell and sort of break script a little bit, but it's really short and I think it's clever. So there's a Zen monk walking with his followers out in the Himalayas, and they're walking up this mountainous path, and they approach this very large rock, and it's really big. It's like 10 stories high. And the Zen monk turns to his followers and he says, "You see that rock?" And everybody looks up and they notice it. And he says to them, "Well, how heavy is that rock?" And of course, the punchline is, "Well, it depends, only if you decide to try to lift it or not." So the perspective taking, right? It's like really creating that shift. Like, is this problem really that rock that I need to feel obligated to lift, to carry, right? Or can we just go around it? Can we take a different route? Can we just leave it be, right? There's nothing for me to do with that. And that's really, again, that ties in, back to, really having that mindfulness, right? When we're feeling distracted by whatever the big rock is in our life, and being able to get back on track so we can perform. Some of the specific techniques that build on everything that we've talked about today is really the communication piece, and again, this has a great foundation in the science and the arts. There's many skills. We decided to drill down on a couple today, but this whole notion of empathic listening, it goes right into what Chris was talking about trust building. And we're all always so eager to talk and to share, and empathic listening first begins with the process of simply that, right? Like letting the other person go first, right? And really waiting, not with that sense of urgency to be able to say something or to be able to problem solve or to be able to create a solution or to give a response, but really like to literally take it all in. And the empathic listening component that's different than just listening and engaging in conversation is validating what the other person just said. So the easy example is, Chris was talking about the importance of building trust. And if I was in a conversation and showing empathic listening with her, I would say, what you said about trust building is really important. And it sounds like you've learned a lot about building trust by being vulnerable and using selective vulnerability to be able to do that in a genuine, authentic way, but in a way that makes a unique impact. So now I've just shown that I have, this reflective listening skill that shows her that I was paying attention to what she said. It conveys a sense of caring. And when you do that, of course, it does build trust, and it builds, the kind of trust that you need in every business relationship, particularly getting through a time of uncertainty. The other component to this is, we're all looking for support. We're all looking for reassurance. And one way to do that in a way that sort of balances the component and essence of vulnerability and also being supportive but not overly intrusive or overly infringing on work boundaries. Things are a little bit fuzzy right now. Is it okay to say, hey, my kids are driving me crazy today because I've been homeschooling for the last 3.5 hours and trying to jump on conference calls and get things done, right? So it's, we're balancing the permission boundaries behind this. And one technique is simply asking someone for permission before you actually give a suggestion or a recommendation, right? You know, Here's what I've heard. Would it be helpful, to you to hear some solutions that some of my friends, some of my coworkers, some of my colleagues, some of my clients have come up with for that, right? So you're asking permission. Then the person is more likely to feel understood. They're more likely to feel invited to be vulnerable. And it's evidence that you're building trust in that relationship, right? So that asking permission component to be able to give them a proposal, here's what I've heard, here's what you might want to try. Maybe try, instead of doing a 3-hour chunk, break it down into 30 minutes, right? Give yourself some 5-minute breaks in between. Do you have a partner that you can take turns with? Can you adjust your work schedule a little bit? These are some of the tips and techniques that I've been hearing about, and I hope some of those are helpful for you. And if you hear about any, please feel free to get back to me and let me know what you've heard, right? So it's this permission-based opportunity for giving proposals and suggestions.
I love that. I think that's so important before we launch into a tirade of here's what you should do, that you get permission to give advice, right? I think that's excellent. And on the reflexive listening skills, I want to add one thing. A lot of people think that actors are just, spouting words, that they are, pretending. And when I first stepped foot into my first acting class, two things happened. One was the definition of acting was redefined, and it's behaving truthfully under imaginary circumstances. And that means that when an actor on screen is, crying or getting mad or on stage, that they are actually genuinely feeling those emotions. And the reason that needs to happen is that we are incredibly sensitive beings. When a gnat lands on my hand, I swat it away because I can feel it. And when an actor on stage is phoning it in or faking it, I check out because I know they're not being authentic or genuine. And so when you're reflecting what somebody has said in a conversation, to me, it's really important that there be authenticity behind it, that you actually ask a question or repeat something in a way that conveys that you actually really do feel with them. I think that's part of empathy, is feeling with. The other thing I learned when I walked in that acting class was an exercise about listening. And it was an exercise called repetition. And it is what it sounds like. Two people get up at the front of the room, and one person notices something about the other person and says it. Eric, I like your shirt. And Eric would say back to me, you like my shirt? And I'd say, yeah, I like your shirt. And we go back and forth like that. It sounds really inane and it kind of is annoying, but until something shifts and Eric says, yeah, you like my shirt. And it's the same words, but we're noticing something. We're noticing two things. We're noticing a shift inside ourselves. So we're paying attention to how we're feeling, and we notice a shift in other people. And so it trains us, going back to the beginning of what we were talking about, it trains us to be in the moment, really noticing what's going on for us internally in the conversation and noticing what's happening with the other person. And it's good training. I wouldn't recommend it with work colleagues because you may say things that make you a little too vulnerable. It goes beyond the realm of selective vulnerability, but it's an excellent exercise. You can Google Meisner technique or Meisner exercises, or Meisner repetition exercises, and get a feel for what it is. But it trains you to be in the moment. And then the final thing I want to say on empathic listening is it's not just about talking. When you're speaking, you have two choices. You can be talking and broadcasting, or you can be involved in drawing the other person's point of view out of them. And Michael Reedy will know that this is a leadership development technique that is fairly common, and it's recognizing when you're actually in inquiry mode versus when you're in advocacy mode. And when we get upset or uncertain, we tend to want to broadcast rather than getting into inquiry and gathering more information, because that's how we actually get more information, is by inquiring, not by broadcasting. And so a rule of thumb that another colleague puts out is that if you are advocating more than 50% of the time in a conversation, you're probably doing too much advocating and need to be more inquiring. And so listening is part of it, but also the way you speak.
Well put. Listening reveals. I saw a couple of hands raised, so I'm going to pop those in just before we get into the wrap up. And feel free to jump in with any questions, because we're just about going to wrap up. We wanted to keep this in accordance with honoring everyone's time. So the question is, how do you introduce vulnerability into a culture that has not traditionally believed that being vulnerable is a positive trait? So the quick answer is ask them to join the second iteration of this webinar, so we can start with a little bit of education about it. On a more serious note, workplace culture takes change, okay? How does change take place? There's an enormous amount of smart people on this call, but, my observations are that, it starts with knowledge, right? Knowledge is power, and you have to have a knowledge basis, a knowledge framework to make change in any culture, right? So it takes, bringing in, quote unquote, an expert on subject matter, right? And when you bring in an expert on subject matter, it informs people. It gives them the opportunity to think about their biases about a particular topic. So if my bias is that, vulnerability is a sign of weakness, I can be informed and rethink that, and perhaps be open to the notion that it could actually be what we call a soft skill, which is actually a strength for psychological competencies and leadership. Chris, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I love everything you said. I think that's spot on. I think there are two things from my side of the house. One is that you want to be modeling selective vulnerability. And when we say selective, I would highlight the selective. So, you go slowly, you do it little bits at a time. You do allow, they're not going to express vulnerability before you do. You have to be the model and the leader. And you can use inquiry to draw out some of their vulnerability as well. But I would say you don't introduce it all at once. It's got to be a slow process with you as the leader.
Yep. And there's a question, Chris, about the author on selective vulnerability.
Yeah. He's not a researcher. He's an executive coach that I work with at certain clients, and he sort of coined the term selective vulnerability. His name is Louis Lubin, Lubin. Louis Lubin.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. And then we have more in the Q&A.
Yep. So let's see if we can pop over here. Okay, one word I haven't heard, thank you, Michael, is patience. One thing I find myself saying during self-talk is Rome wasn't built in a day. How do you foster patience and high energy, capable professionals? Wow. So, let me think about that for a second, because there's a lot embedded into that. But, patience is a state. Okay, so when in psychology, we think about states and traits, right? A trait is being a patient or impatient person most of the time. Okay, I'll qualify it like that. Having patience can be a state, right? So you could be an impatient person. It could be your nature, your proclivity, right? I'm going to use a type A bias as a framework and say, look, type A's are impatient. They want to get things done. They're focused on results, deliverables, right? Well, that doesn't mean that you can't have patience. So I would go back and say the practice of mindfulness is a way to create a state of patience, right? And you don't have to build Rome in a day. And you can have patience and also have a tendency or a drive to actually want to overcome that and stay focused and or even hyper focused on goals and deliverables and objectives, but also recognizing and having that Buddhist, that Zen stance, if you will, with my big rock story, right? That, you know, you're going to try to lift that's Rome being built in a day. Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'd go back to modeling. I think if you want people to behave in a patient way, you need to model patience. I would also say you can reward and acknowledge patience. And then the third way is communication. How do you communicate the values of the organization currently? And how are they modeled? How are they received? Because a state of patience, as Eric said, it could be conveyed as a value, and you can convey it in a way that says, okay, you know, this is a new value we're adding. You can describe what it looks like. You can you can like I said, acknowledge it when it happens. And I don't know about rewarding it. I think I said reward, but you know, just I think the acknowledgement of it and pointing to examples of what patience looks like can be useful.
Yeah, great. Question from Mark. Thank you. Depending on one's workload, how important is it to a person's well-being to volunteer and give back to the community? Yes.
That's what I say.
Yeah, so the science behind that is really solid, that people feel better, right? And it improves their dopamine. When you help others, it creates a state of well-being. So that's the simple answer. Without getting into too much disclosure, I volunteered in a really simple activity last week and had nothing related to do with psychology. It really got down to basic needs. And, you know, this is where we're at, right? Just being helpful, just being human, being personable. And I felt very good after that, but I also know that, you know, it made a difference.
Yeah, I think it's a personal decision, but Eric's absolutely right. The research does point to that just witnessing an act of kindness raises dopamine in the witness, let alone in the two people involved in an act of kindness. And so if you have access to that, even just being kind is something that you could do to give back to the community, and I highly recommend that right now. But in terms of, you know, volunteering and giving back to the community, that's so personal. You know, what can I give? What do I have to give? What do I want to give? What space do I have to give it? I'd say manage your kindness, or manage your giving back on the level that you're able to, and the level that makes sense to you. And if it just means being really kind to a customer service rep when your cat food order isn't filled correctly, then, I mean, not that happened to me this morning, but yeah, I'd say just be aware of your ability to give back in any moment.
Yep. Great. Next from Brian, do you ever use creativity, ideation sessions, as a vehicle for creating vulnerability, trust, and openness in an organization? I'm going to give you a live example. This is really important, and it can happen spontaneously. I don't think you necessarily have to have like a formal session per se. You can keep it really spontaneous, very organic and natural. So at the beginning of a training last week, you know, folks were online and you could see what's in people's backgrounds. And one of the engineers who's with a tech company had in his background all these different devices from over the years, the Trio, the first iPhone, the first typewriter, the first Mac, the first word processing program, the first video game console. And it was really cool because it created vulnerability, trust, openness, everything that you're talking about, right? And it gave people the opportunity and the permission, like we were talking about before, to talk about those kinds of things, right? To have it become a more personalized conversation. And the interesting thing is, this was the team of people that worked with each other for years, and nobody knew this about that particular person, right? So instantly, just in like literally 5 minutes, you're building all of those pathways for strengthening the relationship. So I would say, do it spontaneously. I always like to just lead it in with a question. What are you doing for fun? What are you working on that's not related to work that you're passionate about, right? And then just sit back and listen, and your group will chat and learn.
Yeah.
What do you think, Chris?
Oh, well, Brian knows what I think, actually, I think, but I'll say it for the benefit of everyone else. I wholeheartedly support the use of ideation sessions and creativity as a vehicle for creating vulnerability. And I also believe that, in an organization where I think it was Lisa talked about, how do you introduce vulnerability into an organization that doesn't necessarily value it? I think you have to be the icebreaker, right? So you have to initiate some level of trust and openness in order to get beneficial ideation and brainstorming. And I think I had another thought and it's left me, but it's what it is it's a two-way street. So the more you introduce the vulnerability, which allows creativity, which allows for more vulnerability. It's a sort of a cascading phenomenon.
Yeah. And I'm just going to say one last thing, because I just recalled an article I read in McKinsey this week where there's a real concern about American companies losing innovation because of the pandemic, right? Because we're stressed, we're less creative, which to me fundamentally makes sense. So I think it's really important to dive into this creative think tank opportunities, spontaneous or otherwise, structured or unstructured, right? Because innovation is what's really driving a knowledge economy, really important stuff. Next question is terrific. Chris, do you want to take this? Are there books or podcasts that you would recommend to support your presentation today?
Two things came to mind immediately. One is, I referenced this at the beginning. There's a book, a very old book called Teaching with the Brain in Mind by I think his name is Brian Jensen or Eric Jensen. It's Jensen though. And he's the one that talks about a state of relaxed preparedness and also ritual building before teaching. So having rituals in place that allow the brain to be open. It's a really good read. And then the other one is Dare to Lead by Brene Brown, or anything TED Talks by Brene Brown on vulnerability. Super rich, densely rich resource. How about
and
you?
I'll just beg your pardon, and I'll just add in one podcast, On Being with Krista Tippett. I assume a lot of people are familiar with it. If not, she has a very nice portfolio of world-renowned experts that speak about their lifelong work on many of the topics that we've talked about today. All right, I think that may have wrapped this up. Let's see. Yeah, I think we've got all of the questions answered. I'm just going to post up our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us, extend the conversation forward. We really enjoyed having you all today and giving us this opportunity to share this with you, the benefit of our expertise and our experiences in working with clients and organizations, and look forward to hearing good news and feedback from all of you. Oh, one more question, and Chris, I'll let you sign off. Oh, thank you. Well, thank you. We really appreciate all of that.
So Gaia says, the older I get, the more I'm becoming type A personality. I believe it used to be more laid back and manage stress better. Is type A B something that can be changed with mindset changes, or does one accept, or do I accept that I have a type A and try to mitigate the anxiety with mindfulness techniques? I go back to what I was saying to Brian about, as you change one thing, the other changes. So, try the mindful techniques and see what happens with your type A behavior. I think there's a lot to be said for letting things be as they are and acceptance of the way things are that brings a lot of serenity and calmness that you might benefit from.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could make a quick case and say that everyone that's on this webinar is type A, right? Because we're lifelong continuous learners, and really focused on bettering oneself and bettering other people and being leaders with the people that we're involved with. But yes, I mean, all of these techniques that we talked about today, you don't have to change who you are. You are who you are, and you're lucky to be who you are, and that's your gift, right? And it's the approach that I like to take with this is really just acknowledging the notion, like, look, we all have strengths and weaknesses. Be aware of your strengths, be aware of your weaknesses, polish the weaknesses, and you will move on and be able to be a very happy, balanced type A person.
Yes, and leverage your strengths. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely Thursday, and be well and stay healthy.